I'm Dr. Matt Harvey of Victoria University, and I'm the treasurer of ESAANZ. And it's been my pleasure to put this seminar together. We have three excellent speakers. Dr. Romain Fati of Flinders University, joining us from Adelaide with no lockdown. We have Dr. Garen Gergich from University of Sydney, and Dr. Emma Shortis from RMIT. I would like to acknowledge the people of the Wurundjeri of the Kulin Nation, on whose land I am presently located. And Gorana is joining us from Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and Romain will give his own welcome to country from his location. Now, we are recording this event. I hope that's all right with everyone. And wanted to stress that tonight's speakers are all expressing their personal views. So our first speaker is Dr. Romain Fati, who's senior lecturer at Flinders University and a chercheur associé at the Centre d'Histoire des Sciences Po in Paris, and specializes in the First World War and Australian identity, but as a Frenchman in Adelaide, now is a time where the impact of AUKUS is being very strongly felt. So we'll see his perspectives on that. Then Gorana will address us, and then finally Emma. We'll keep questions to the end, please, but we do hope that when the time comes, you'll have a lot of questions. So I'd like to invite Romain to give us his presentation.
Well, thank you very much for your invitation. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see whether this works. Now, if it works, you should see a logo of Flinders University. All good. Thank you very much. I would just like to start by acknowledging that I speak from the land of the Gorana people, whose connection to the land, unceded land, I acknowledge, and I thank you for allowing me to talk today. Now, I've chosen a bit of a provocative title so we can have a good afternoon together. The cost of subjection: what repercussions might Australia expect from France and the EU over the AUKUS and its submarines deal? As a historian, I'll start with a few historical pointers. And I'll start a long way back, because my presentation is going to discuss more the submarines than AUKUS, even though these two are linked. Australia has operated submarines for quite a while, in fact, since the First World War, but the submarines have not always been Australian. After World War II, you've got British submarines stationed in Australia, up until the point where Britain goes, Australia, you better get your own, because we're going to be out of here by the end of the 60s, so please plan ahead. To which Australia said, sure, we're going to build, well, you're going to build in Scotland submarines for Australia. We're in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. This is known as the Oberon class. Then, of course, a submarine has a lifespan. Soon came the time to renew the fleet. So new planning, new designing phase, and this time, not British, but Swedish design, partly Australian built submarines, Collins class, plagued with issues, still in operation. And then in 2010, we had the same discussion about planning and renewing. There were discussion about getting German submarines, getting Japanese submarines, and the French ended up almost unexpectedly getting this contract, which they were very happy about, but it came as quite as a surprise in Australia at the time, for a reason that we may delve in. And now we're saying, well, AUKUS deal, no French subs anymore. We're going to get nuclear-propelled American submarines. But we're going to have the same question in about 20 years' time, renewing the fleet. So the point that I want to make here is that the problem that we are discussing here in terms of operational dimension of submarines is one we have had at least 3 times before in the past. And that is worrying me as someone who lives in Australia. It seemed that we are incapable of doing things on our own. And that was part of the interest of the French deal, was the transfer of technology. And I'll delve into this. But we need to remember that this is not a unique situation, that Australia has had to make these choices in the past and probably in the future for as long as we don't do things on our own, which I know and acknowledge comes at a far greater cost, but that might be a cost worth to pay to be a bit more sovereign. Now, again, history was that connection with France. The contract signed in 2015, something natural for Australia? Not at all, absolutely not. A great contract if you want my personal opinion as a Frenchman who lives in Australia, but as a historian, it was not coherent with Australian history. I mean, initially, you'd remember, 1788, Australia's settlement or colonization. There was a great mistrust that the French could invade and take over. Of course, that mistrust went through the 19th century, but Australia has had that fear of, a French invasion, a Russian invasion, a Japanese invasion. It's kind of part and parcel of Australian imagination. There's often been tensions between Australia and France. Again, I'm talking the last 150 years, between France and Australia of a French territory in the Pacific. It seems to me that Australians always tend to think that the French will one day pack and go home. No, 2 million citizens of France live in the Pacific. It's as preposterous as saying that one day Australians will pack and leave Australia. It's not going to happen. But sometimes, I hear the word, French colonies in the Pacific. No, these are fully integrated territory to the Republic. They are full citizen. They've got voting rights. They've voted several times to remain French. This is their agency and choice. So the relationships between France and Australia, even though in diplomatic spheres you speak about the ANZAC and this long tradition, that's a furphy. In real terms, they've always been very, very thin. And sometimes they've been tense. Some of you may remember nuclear testing in the Pacific up until the mid-90s with the French. So the French were not the flavor of the month in Australia, or many decades, in fact. And in fact, President François Hollande was the first French president to visit Australia in 2014 from memory. And then President Emmanuel Macron came after, when he himself became president. So the links were very, very tenuous. And as we know, Australia moved from being a British colony to a federation within the British Empire. And it's important to remind everybody, and I'm sure Australians would know this, that during World War II, you've got more than 1 million Americans staying in Australia, a population that is less than 8 million. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that before we talk about AUKUS and the way that Australia turns its back on France, the point that I want to make is that France has never been a traditional ally of Australia. It's been a neighbor, someone that you say hello to every now and then, but it's not London and it's not Washington. And there perhaps has been a miscalculation in France. We thought about it not as a military contract, but as a real partnership and alliance, when in fact Australians just wanted to buy the submarines. The alliance was just wording on the top of the cake, but clearly it became very clear that they didn't buy in that. So now let's focus on what was at stake here. Now, for France, I believe, had an amazing project. The idea was that by forging this alliance with Australia, it would propose with the European Union a third way. And I use the word third way because it's one that you can find, troisième voie, in French diplomatic white papers that you can download on the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France. Of course, it's not like a real third way. We know who our friends and allies are. There was never a discussion of putting China, the US, and France and everyone else in the middle. The idea of third way was one of more critical independence, where France would offer a way to countries such as Australia to develop their own capacities to be a bit more independent and neutral and not have compulsorily to align to one or the other big parties that are having their own problems, and in this way propose to Australia not to be drawn in something that perhaps it could avoid. So this was part of an Indo-Pacific reconfiguration of French diplomacy that started to become a real thing really with President Hollande. Emmanuel Macron worked as part of governments that served under President Hollande. And then that was pushed even further when Emmanuel Macron became president of the French Republic. So the idea was to propose another way in the Pacific, one where you wouldn't see the two big blocs opposing, which would create a way for France and the European Union to develop greater partnership, which ambition would be to promote trade, but also maintain peace in the region. I think that that is one of the key agenda, to maintain peace and freedom of movement in the region in a way that is not aggressive or militaristic. And that came as part and parcel of a contract. So you've got a contract, which is literally, well, plenty of set of documents to buy submarines. But as part of the submarine deal, France really thought that it was proposing an alternative to Australia to get a closer relationship within the Pacific region. And of course, the day AUKUS was announced is the day where the strategy for the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific of the European Union was announced as well. And much of the views of France were aligned on the European Union and vice versa, because this wasn't developed only in Paris. It's a way of promoting and pushing forward the Union. Australia saw this in a different way. I mean, the connection with London have always been very strong. The connection with America are more than strong. We think of Afghanistan, we think of Iraq, we think of Vietnam, we think of the Korean War. That tradition has been going on for quite a while. A great deal of the American assets in the Pacific are located here in Australia. That has been going on since the Cold War. It's nothing new at all. So France was coming very late to the party, perhaps underestimating the cultural relationship and military relationship between Australia and the US. But what it's doing now is that it's changing its strategy nearly overnight. The submarines it was going to buy for France had the purpose of safeguarding Australia's border. They were diesel electric. They're not meant to be sent for long deployment. It's defense. Nuclear subs propelled are attack submarines. They are for projection. So in terms of military strategy, I think that's something that hasn't been really well discussed, but it's a big, big move. And also something that hasn't been discussed is who is going to operate the nuclear chamber of the submarines that we're going to get apparently from America. You need nuclear engineers for that, military engineers that have nuclear capacity, and I'm not aware that Australia has them. So everything was going well. Everything was not going great. Australia complained a few times to Naval Group. There's been a lot of talks going on, but I think French institutions did not foresee that the deal would collapse, and certainly they did not foresee it would collapse in such abrupt way. And I think that is one of the things that's going to have a longer term repercussion, because it's not about the submarines. France is the third largest arms dealer. You know, the fact that Naval Group is going to lose, I think, 9 or 10% of its production, it's important, but it's not massive. What's really important for France is the way it was treated by an ally, or what it thought was an ally. And overall, I mean, the most critical terms coming out of Paris have been quite damning, but the dominating idea is that there is a lot of amateurism going on in Canberra. I mean, whether the French are right or wrong, that's not the point. I'm just presenting that view. But the key point there is that trust is gone. And that is a point that has been made a few times by Jean-Yves Le Drian, who is the current Minister for Foreign Affairs. He's also the man that oversaw the deal when he was Minister for Defense in a previous government. So that idea that, you know, can we trust Australia? Australia signs a deal and then says, well, we're not doing it. What is the currency of your word, of your signature on a treaty? And there's even been words used such as adversaire, not enemy, adversary. So ministers, member of parliaments, you know, really important people in France did comment that that move could be expected from an adversary, but not from an ally. If you want to walk out of the deal, just inform us, get into that procedure, but just don't organize a press conference and cut communication. That is just terrible, terrible, terrible manners. Subsequently, as you know, the French president called back the French ambassador to Australia, and the ambassador has now returned, and in his statement he said that he was to reassess the relationship with Australia. What this means, we don't know, but certainly the great friendship that had been Of course, there'll be costs for Australia, the least of which will be the cost of breaking the contract. That's going to be a lot of money, but it's just money. I think the most important things really is going to be played out at European level. As you know, France is going to take over the presidency of the Council of the European Union in January, so in a few months' time. And some of the key words that are coming out of the Elysee at the moment is about, you know, having a strong European Union, one that is powerful, one that is on the road to recovery, and one where there is a sense of belonging. Australia at the moment is negotiating free trade agreement with the European Union, and this was facilitated by France. This was always part of the submarine deals, whereby France would assist Australia to get the best deal possible. Theoretically, the free trade agreement need to be approved by every single parliament of the European Union, and that was the case for Canada. But with a partnership with France, there was a deal broken that the FTAs would only validate it at European level rather than in each parliament, making it easier for Australia. But now that this has happened, there's a lot of question as to how nice the French and the Europeans are going to be. Now, of course, one could say that French submarines are not a problem for, you know, other countries like Spain and Belgium, but it's not only about French submarines, it's about Indo-Pacific policy for France, but also for the European Union. And I think some hard thinking will happen. I've put a couple of one Twitter post from Renaud Muselier, who is the president of a region in the south of France. Not that he's a significant political figure in France, but like many others, he has called for French authorities to weigh in into the negotiation of the free trade agreement. More important has been the call, I think, of Monsieur Cambon, who is the president of the Defense Commission of the Senate in France, who has made the same point. With the submarine deal done in such a way, we need to make sure that we review the way we're going to help Australia with its free trade agreement. And these consequences may be very real. I mean, the EU is Australia's third trading partner, but Australia is only the 19th trading partner of the European Union. So there is a real imbalance of power. And of course, there will not be called retaliations, but there will be consequences. If we are to believe the current political consensus in France, left, right, or center, because what has happened is still a very sore point. Now, I'll conclude within 2 minutes. I think there is a need to be careful there, because as a French citizen living in Australia, I wouldn't like to see the baby being thrown out with the bathwater. Yes, it is true, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs in France has a very, very, very long, in fact, century-long memory, something that I think, you know, young Australian diplomacy does not necessarily understand. But around Naval Group, there was a real ecosystem of French companies that came, whether it's in Adelaide or in other part of the country. And it will be interesting to see whether France continue to facilitate their insertion and their work in Australia, or whether they withdraw and don't have that same relationship with Australia. That, I think, we can only find out through time. But there are also consequences for Australia. I mean, the free trade agreement, the discussion is ongoing, and it will be interesting to see what is going to happen in terms of, you know, tariff, like real economic dimension of this. There is a consequence of perhaps a loss of sovereignty. We have to remember that part of the French deal was about transferring very important technology for the first time for the French, really, in order to make Australia able to create their own fleets and maintain it in the future. So part of the problem that I've shown about every 20 years thinking about, you know, where are we going to get submarines, perhaps could have been sorted in the longer time. That was about building Australian sovereign capacity and industrial capacity. And that may be out of the water, because there is a lot of talk about, yes, the submarines of America will be built in Adelaide. I mean, that's complete nonsense. We do not know how to build a nuclear reactor for submarine in Australia, unless I'm mistaken and someone is doing it in the desert, but I believe that's not the case. So there's been a lot of talk about AUKUS, but really technologically speaking, that doesn't stand the test of reality. And also one of the worst consequences is perhaps to antagonize China where it wasn't necessary. So in conclusions, well, at the moment, there is no contract with the United States. There might be no submarines until 2040, which would leave Australia exposed with an operational gap, because the Collins class will need to be retired. So does it mean we're going to lease submarines? In which case, will there be American personnel in these submarines to operate Australian submarines? So that's a huge issue for sovereignty and deployment. And at the moment, we've got no nuclear capacity, and it's not something you can do in 2, 3, 4 years' time. It takes a long, long time. And also on the greater scale, like, what is Australia's signature and word on a contract worth? With European partners, you can be sure that whenever Australia is discussing something with other European nations, they will be aware of what has happened, or the French will make sure that they're aware that Australia can shift nearly overnight. That is diplomatically very costly for a country. And there is that great alignment with the US, which makes us a very big target. I mean, who do Australians think they are if we think that we can stand our ground if there was something happening, say, over Taiwan? Australia has no aircraft carrier. Australia has no nuclear weapon, no first strike or second strike capacity. I mean, like, we military don't exist. And you know, it's a real issue. And the loss of industrial and geopolitical sovereignty, not to mention the potential FTA impacts. So I've put that slide of utopia because I think it's very representative of the lot of the words that have been used by the Morrison government. I'm yet to see actions or contracts or real things happening, because to me, AUKUS seems like throwing something that you knew was going to happen for something that is very uncertain. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Romain. And that was both a long historical perspective, and looks like it will take us a long way into the future as well. So now I'd like to ask Dr. Garen Gergich to speak to us. She's a jointly appointed senior lecturer in the Department of Government and International Relations and the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney, and also currently a research fellow at the NATO Defence College. So she can give us a NATO perspective on this. Gorana.
Thank you so much, Matt, and hello to everyone. As Matt said, I'm reporting from Gadigal lands of the Eora Nation, where Sydney University campuses stand. So I would like to acknowledge their leaders, past, present, and emerging. That was a really fascinating presentation by Roman, and I think it gives us really a kind of deeper look into some of the contentions over the AUKUS agreement, and specifically the bilateral relationship between Australia and France. What I would like to do, even though the whole event name is AUKUS and the EU, actually is to take a kind of step back and look at some of the grand strategic and just in general strategic discussions that have been had over on both sides of the Atlantic. So I'm approaching this from a perspective of a transatlanticist, given that that's my research expertise. And what I want to do is look first into what the sort of continuities and changes have been over at the US side in terms of the strategic outlook, in terms of the spelled out strategies under the previous 2-3 administrations, and then take a look at what's been going on in Europe vis-a-vis the Indo-Pacific, so hopefully giving us a bit more fodder for discussion later on when we get back into the discussion of AUKUS and the EU specifically. So to start with the zeitgeist in Washington, there is a sense nowadays that basically we have seen a major shift in the paradigm when it comes to US-China relations, and that basically competition has replaced cooperation, that there is a bipartisan consensus on China in Washington, which is informed by both national security hawks as well as those who are trade protectionists, and also having impact, those who are advocating a stronger stance regarding human rights, are all sort of converging in their recommendations that the US needs to be much tougher on China, which contributes to this sort of competition paradigm. And in light of that, there seems to be a very limited set of opportunities for cooperation, with very little to almost no sign of accommodation from US side. Obviously, no one wants conflict, but there is certainly a lot of disagreement as to how to go about then dealing with China in this under this new paradigm and under these new sort of circumstances. And we've seen this both under the kind of paradigm shift, both under the Trump administration that brought back in this language of great power competition or great power rivalry or strategic competition. We've seen that in some of the key national security documents, whether you're talking about security strategy or the defense strategy that were published under the Trump administration, over to what is the interim national security strategic guidance under the Biden administration, which also talks about strategic competition, but really makes the difference and kind of distinction between China being a specific type of challenge as opposed to a Trump administration that used to put in Russia in that same basket. So that kind of continuity in terms of the strategic outlook and the sort of substance of the US orientation towards China is one that is very clear. Certainly, there are also continuities when it comes to US policy in the region, which has largely been about managing relations with China. So whether we call the region the Asia Pacific or the Indo-Pacific, we have seen a lot of the kind of continuities where they sometimes were the product of less deliberate sort of policy moves and sometimes very deliberate policy implementation from the previous two administrations going into the incumbent one. So basically, we had the 2011 announcement of the Asia Pacific pivot or the rebalance, because pivot sounded very harsh and got a lot of feathers ruffled. And under the Obama administration, the idea was basically to reinvest attention as well as to shift assets to this part of the world in order to it was first said to reap the benefits of what is the most dynamic and kind of fastest growing region, but also keeping an eye on China's rise or return, depending on how far your reach into history goes in terms of its status as a major or a great power in the international system. And Obama's pivot was really thought of as a kind of three-pronged strategy, where there would be this investment into enhanced economic integration through the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, strengthening military alliances and partnerships, and again, shifting some military assets to this part of the world, as well as a ramped up diplomatic engagement and this sort of idea of a pivot within the pivot, where the US has traditionally been cooperating with its East Asian allies at the expense of those in Southeast Asia, and that it would consciously do much more to engage Southeast Asian nations. Obviously, what happened was that because of different sort of things that occurred in the second half of Obama's administration, the administration actually wasn't able to live up to the promise of a three-pronged pivot, and what remained was actually this military arm as the most obvious way of engaging in the region. So TPP goes nowhere. Obviously, Obama has no hands in the Congress, in the Senate, where he would need to ratify the treaty. So it becomes basically just something that is at the level of the executive sort of agreement and signaling that there is a willingness to do it at that level, but obviously Trump revokes it the moment that he gets into the office. And with diplomacy, there are a lot of obviously distractions that happen in the second term, whether they came from Europe or Eurasia broadly, or from the Middle East, that basically made that sort of promise of greater diplomatic engagement more of an aspiration rather than a reality. And then we get to the Trump administration, which was more deliberate about the kind of military arm and really didn't care too much about talking the language or actually practicing multilateralism. It certainly introduces this sort of approach of economic statecraft into the mix, so very different from the approach of trade liberalization. Obviously, Trump's trade wars hurt not only China, but also in the way that tariffs are being slapped around, hurt allies as well. But there is a very notable shift here in the way that the Trump administration sees the region through the prism of the Indo-Pacific, and specifically engaging India along with some of the traditional allies like Australia and Japan into elevating the quadrilateral dialogue, which would later on be much more important, as we see these days under the Biden administration. So under Trump, Trump, again, this is more deliberate, that there is a very kind of strong military and security aspect to the relationship, rather than, or to the strategy rather than the one that became a kind of product of different contingencies and maybe unintended sort of moves that we saw under the Obama administration. And so we come to the Biden years, and one thing that's clear, that at least in these first 10 months now or so, is that a lot of the engagement is actually done and has been seen through the prism again of defense and security, right? From the announcement of the AUKUS agreement to the cooperation within the Quad, even though it is touting to be a much sort of broader partnership that seeks to, address issues that have to do with, supply chain security to dealing with the pandemic. But there is this sort of sense that it is largely about matters that fall into kind of geopolitics rather than necessarily, again, engaging in other sort of spheres or utilizing other tools when it comes to foreign policy craft. So I'd be reluctant to talk about kind of definitively what Biden's doctrine really is, but it's very clear that Biden is borrowing things, that there is a kind of element of something old, that there are elements of something new. Some have said that basically Biden is Trump with allies, essentially, in terms of the kind of substance, but, the implementation being a bit different. I would say, it's always a bit more complicated for obviously some of these catchy sort of phrases obviously get a lot of traction, but it's very clear that obviously the challenges that Biden has on the domestic front are ones that are taking up a lot of policymaking bandwidth. And so they are in a way tying his hands to act on the foreign policy front, maybe at the level that he would like to, but also that there is this sense really that with the change paradigm, there are certain limits, and there have been certain sort of institutions put in place, so to speak, that are that have made the kind of Biden policy, again, in some respects, continuation from the Trump years, more than a kind of radical break. I think the biggest sort of challenge that Biden has in front of him is this sort of issue of compartmentalization. And what I mean by this, so you can see in front of you the piece that Biden penned for the Foreign Affairs back in March, April of last year, kind of putting forward his case for American leadership, where he says that China is this special challenge, right? That America needs to compete with China, but at the same time needs to find a way to cooperate and to work on issues of governing the global commons, whether it's the global health or climate action or arms control. So kind of competing strategically, but at the same time trying to find a way to work together, which obviously begs the question how Beijing sees it and whether it actually wants to work on these terms. And I think that this sort of, we've seen that John Kerry, the former Secretary of State and the current kind of climate czar, shuttling to Beijing and not being able to get to any sort of deal, because obviously there is this sort of sense, well, what is it, what's in it for China to cooperate on this front, when at the same time it's seeing a lot of the kind of bellicosity from the US, or perceives it as such. So this is where I'm going to park the discussion of Washington's view, and then just get to the other side of the Atlantic and see really what the prospects for transatlantic coordination and cooperation over in this part of the world are. And I would note that the pivotal year actually in terms of, or the pivotal years for the kind of prospects of cooperation are probably 2018, 2019, and I'll explain why. So 2019, from the perspective of the European Union, was a major one, given that the EU published this strategic outlook on its relations with China, where obviously that key sentence where it referred to China as both a partner and a competitor, as well as a systemic rival, is one that really made the headlines, and it has stuck. Actually, we've seen it repeated time and time again these days when it comes to EU's perception of China's promotion of alternative models of governance, or the way that it seeks to pursue its technological leadership, that way that it competes often on the economic front. It's very much clear it's not anymore just a kind of a story of engagement and partnership necessarily. But we've also seen that prior to this strategic outlook, we've seen at least some initiatives actually from the level of member states who have been thinking about the region, right, and kind of through that formulation and articulation of their Indo-Pacific strategies have told us what their position is on the rise or return of China, right? So France was the first mover among European states when it formulated its Indo-Pacific strategy back in 2018. Roman already referred to some of this, so I'm not going to go into it much further, but really France seeing itself as a veritable Indo-Pacific power. Unlike, say, Germany, that was at first very reluctant and somewhat apprehensive first to use the term Indo-Pacific, but then by the end of 2020 articulated its own policy guidelines on the Indo-Pac region, where it said that it would want to make sure that the region is not dominated by a single or two hegemons, a kind of condominium of power. And then the Netherlands soon followed suit when it published its Indo-Pacific guidelines, calling for EU to act more as a realpolitik power. And you can see that Netherlands probably fired all of its graphic designers, given that this was actually the way that its strategy looked like. So they really didn't go past the kind of Calibri font, I think, in Word documents. If there are any Dutch here, I apologize. This was just meant to be a kind of funny comment. I'm not making a comment on the substance of the strategy, but rather the visuals. Anyway. And obviously, the three member states acted as a way, as a propeller in a way, in EU's formulation of its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which was basically a response to first the Council's conclusions that came about in April of this year, calling for the Commission and HRVP to elaborate a strategy, which was published just basically around the time that AUKUS was announced just last month. And that document signaled EU's ambition to boost its role in the region and to consolidate the existing bilateral engagement with the region that exists at the level of member states. Now, and I can see that I'm slowly getting to the time, so just quickly a couple of notes on EU's actorness then in the Indo-Pacific and a couple of words on NATO before I wrap up. I think for EU's strategy in the Indo-Pacific, it's certainly, you know, in terms of its ambition, it far surpasses similar strategic outlooks to other developing regions such as Africa or Latin America. Also, I think it's notable that EU decided to actually adopt the term Indo-Pacific as a geographic term of reference, because this signals this kind of acceptance of strategic competition paradigm that's been furthered by the United States and some of its key regional allies. But obviously, the question is around the capabilities that the EU has around the way that it's being recognized in the region, right? What constitutes sort of that kind of our actorness dilemma, right? And whether it has the kind of competencies, whether it is able to act in an autonomous fashion, and also whether it is cohesive in the way that it acts. So whether there is a kind of unanimity over what it should be doing in the region. On NATO, just briefly, NATO has increasingly been paying attention to this part of the world. I have also been paying attention to what NATO has been doing in the context of this institutional initiative of NATO 2030 that was launched by the Sec General. And so NATO has this approach which says that it wants to have global approach, but not global presence. We are yet to see what this is going to look like in terms of its strategic concept that's going to be launched next year at the Madrid summit. But certainly there is no shortage of recognition that NATO needs to find a way to deal with the challenge that is China, that touches also in the transatlantic space. But the way that it's going to do that obviously needs to be based on consensual basis. So I think that when it comes to NATO's policies, we are probably going to get some sort of statement again that is going to be markedly different from the last strategic concept, which made actually no mention of China. But I think that a lot of the momentum and engagement is still going to be reserved for member states rather than the institution itself. So to just wrap up with the prospects for coordination and cooperation in this part of the world when it comes to transatlantic alliance, I think that there is certainly a lot of alignment in terms of the diagnosis of challenges, but in terms of the prescriptions, there is a lot of divergence there. I think most of the prospect for cooperation actually remains outside of hard security matters. So in some of the functional areas such as development, regional infrastructure, diplomatic initiatives, this is where certainly EU can lead the way. But for the time being, it seems that at least from the perspective of the US and the way that it engages with the region, there is always this kind of stress and emphasis on what appears to be a military build-up, almost an arms race at the expense of economic engagement and diplomatic engagement. And I'll leave it here and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Gorana. You took us right around the world from the North Atlantic and back to the Indo-Pacific. Now I'd like to call on Dr. Emma Shortis, the author of Our Exceptional Friend, Australia's Fatal Alliance with the United States, recently published by Hardy Grant. And she's a research fellow at the EU Centre at RMIT. Emma.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you to my fellow panelists, Romana and Gorana. I too, of course, would like to begin by acknowledging the people of the Woi Wurrung and Boon Wurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands I live and work, and I respectfully acknowledge their ancestors and elders, past and present. So I am also a historian, and I wanted to provide a little bit more historical context, I suppose, for this AUKUS alliance from the Australian perspective, which I hope will really kind of complement the discussion of European and transatlantic perspectives that we've already had. And I think when, if we're talking, of course, about a historical perspective from Australia, what we're talking about is an examination, of course, of the history of Australia's alliance with the United States and Australia's relationship with Britain Britain specifically as a place separate from Europe. And I think that the historical context of those two relationships explains, I think, quite well kind of how AUKUS came about and what it might mean for the future of Australia in our region and for the future of those relationships as well. So that primarily, I think, involves looking back at the history, or the beginning really, of Australia's security alliance with the United States, which is actually 70 years old this year. The Australia, New Zealand, United States Security Treaty, as it is still called, even though New Zealand is not really officially a part of it anymore, is 70 this year. It was signed in 1951. So as many of you, I'm sure, are aware, ANZUS was born really out of the Second World War, and the assumption that war is inevitable. So as the kind of popular history goes, in even kind of early on in the Second World War, it became really undeniable what many people had suspected for a long time, which is that the United Kingdom, which the British Empire, could no longer be relied upon to protect the Commonwealth in the Pacific. And then with the fall of Singapore and events in Northern Australia, that becomes undeniable. And the Australian government is kind of, I suppose, driven, and this is often kind of characterised as a logical move, is driven to look for another protector, to look for a white protector to replace this enormous security hole that's left by the British Empire. And this goes very, very much to Romain's comments about Australians doing things on their own and really an inability, I suppose, to do things on our own. The United States at the time, in the aftermath of the Second World War, was very reluctant to come in, to step in and fill this hole left by the British Empire, but ended up giving the Australian government the ANZUS Treaty, this official security relationship with the United States, really for two reasons. In order to get the Australian government to sign the peace treaty with Japan that the United States had negotiated, that the Australian government was obstinately refusing to sign. And also really as a kind of reward for the Australian government's committing around 17,000 troops to the United States war in Korea, which the Menzies government did enthusiastically and very quickly, made a real effort to beat Britain to promising troops on the ground in order really to prove Australian worthiness to the United States. So that's really why Australia got the ANZUS Treaty out of the United States, for those two reasons. But the ANZUS Treaty has still never really been enough, I suppose, to calm those fears about about Australian security and the assurance of Australian security. So we do have Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty, which is often framed as a security guarantee for Australia from the United States. But it's really nothing of the sort. If you look at the text, it's a promise by all parties to act in the event of a common danger. And, as we know, I suppose a promise to act can mean almost anything. It could certainly mean that the United States would come to Australia's rescue should Australia ever need that. But it could also mean, a strongly worded statement at the United Nations Security Council. And Australian governments have always been painfully aware of this. I think they have been aware that ANZUS doesn't provide the kind of security guarantee that something like NATO, which Gorana spoke about, does provide. ANZUS is nothing like NATO. So really, since then, since ANZUS was signed, and because of the lessons that came out of the Korean War, that if you kind of enthusiastically participate in American wars, you will be rewarded with a kind of almost promise of American security. Because of this, the Australian governments and successive Australian governments really have assumed that it's necessary to really enthusiastically participate in American wars in order to shore up this kind of not quite promise that it will prove us really worthy of American protection. And I think that's at least partly why, historically, since the signing of ANZUS, we've seen a consistent deepening and broadening of the alliance outside of this kind of central pillar of the ANZUS Treaty into an entire security apparatus around it. So from ANZUS to Australia's accession to the Five Eyes Agreement, to the joint defence facilities such as Pine Gap, to Australia's participation in the war in Vietnam, to Australia's participation in the war on terror, to having rotations of American Marines in Darwin, and now, of course, to AUKUS. So in that sense, AUKUS absolutely isn't a breach in the history of Australia's relationship with the United States, as much as sometimes it's, I think, been portrayed as that, as something kind of radically new and different when it comes to Australia's security relationship with the United States and Australia's approach to the region. I would argue that it's in fact historically quite consistent and a not unpredictable development. But what I do want to emphasize is that historical analysis isn't to minimize the significance, the great significance, I think, of Australia going nuclear, which is a huge deal. And a lot of the analysis I have seen has been kind of very specific about how, this isn't necessarily, we can't necessarily describe this as Australia going nuclear because, nuclear powered submarines are very different to nuclear weapons, or they're very different to having something like a local nuclear power industry. But I would say, as somebody who's paid close attention to the history of the alliance and this deepening and broadening of the alliance, that what these kind of steps usually precede is a further extension of this. So I think, even rhetorically, there's not a huge leap given what we've seen from the acquisitions of nuclear submarines to the development of a local nuclear power industry in Australia. And you can see already organisations like the Australian Minerals Council and certain voices, conservative voices in particular, that have been champions of nuclear industry, calling for this as a logical development. And again, historically, we can see those patterns playing out even when it comes to nuclear weapons. Rhetorically, there's not a huge step from nuclear-powered submarines to nuclear-powered submarines that also has nuclear weapons. I don't think that's a particularly radical analysis, and I think you can see the groundwork being laid for that already. Okay, so I suppose that's kind of my very quick historical analysis of the logic of Australia's deepening of its security relationship with the United States through this submarines deal. But what of Britain? I think there was some surprise that the UK is part of this announcement, and Britain's really, I suppose, reintegration into Australia's understanding of its own security in the Pacific. And I think there are a number of explanations for that, and really, without wishing to be too glib, I think much of the imperial nostalgia that drove Brexit in particular, of which there's been some particularly excellent analysis, the same imperial nostalgia that is driving Boris Johnson's ideas of a global Britain and the kind of role that Britain is going to play in the world, has its parallels in Australia, and has its very vocal and powerful admirers in Australia. It wasn't so long ago that we had an enthusiastic monarchist as a prime minister who was kind of bestowing knighthoods on Prince Philip, to much ridicule, I suppose. But I think that's also emblematic of Australia's historic relationship to Britain. There is, I think, as I mentioned earlier, and as Roman outlined so clearly, Australia has a really long history of seeing Britain as entirely outside of Europe, as not at all part of Europe, and seeing our relationship in that regard, in that very specific way. If anything, Europe is a kind of betrayal of Australia's historic relationship with the United Kingdom. And if we kind of broaden our scope out from AUKUS into trade and this idea of global Britain, when Johnson and Morrison signed the memorandum of understanding, I think they called it, about the UK Australia trade deal, and did that kind of symbolic swap of Tim Tams and Penguin biscuits. The Australian Trade Minister, Dan Tehan, said that this trade agreement in part rights an historic wrong which occurred 50 years ago when the UK turned to Europe and left Australia in many ways abandoned. And I think that word abandoned is just so indicative of Australia's relationship, not just with Britain, but with the world, and goes very much to what Roman was saying about Australia's relationship with the French, and this fear of abandonment, which is in fact the title of an excellent book about the history of Australia's role in the world by Alan Gingell. And I think, to answer your question, Roman, the French did dramatically underestimate this and Australian fears of abandonment, but very specific fears of abandonment by the British and the Americans. And I think that goes a little way, at least, to explaining the kind of indifference to the French that we have seen and that we've spoken about this evening. One of the questions I've been asked quite a few times, and it's an entirely logical and important question, is why couldn't the French just be part of this agreement? Like, why don't we have AUKUS or whatever you want to call it? And I think Australia's historic relationship with the United States and its seeking out of this protection from the United States and the United Kingdom partly explains that and really puts the lie, I think, to some of the narrative overlay that's been put over AUKUS when, we talk about this, or we hear talk about this alignment of democracies against autocracies, which, to go back to what Gorana was speaking about, has been a kind of suggested is what the Biden doctrine is. He went to the G7, he went to Europe, he went to Russia, talking about the need to align democracies against autocracies. So if we apply that logic to this AUKUS agreement, then of course it's an obvious question, why aren't the French involved? French democracy is at least as old, depending on what benchmarks you take, as American democracy. And in fact, the French played a pretty critical role in the development of American democracy through the Revolutionary War. And again, this is about long historical memories that perhaps Australian governments don't appreciate. But I think we can explain that. I think we can explain the apparent failure to even consider that the French could be part of this agreement through this analysis of fear of abandonment and Australia's historical role, like historical relationship with the United States and what it is for, what it is regarded as being for. And that's also why, again, we see a relative indifference to the consequences, not just for Australia's relationship with the French, but for Australia's relationship with the European Union. The Australian government seems to have been kind of taken by surprise, I think, by the vehemence of the reaction coming out of not just France, but the European Union in particular. And I think, the diplomatic consequences of that and the trade consequences of that are potentially really significant because, as we heard outlined so clearly, the French were playing a critical role in the EU-Australia free trade agreement negotiations, and that will change. We've heard noises coming out of the Commission about the future of that relationship and how this might proceed. And I think if we take that alongside what the Australian government is about to do in Glasgow, I think we've opened up a window really where the European Union, I think, would be well within its rights to ratchet up the pressure on Australia when it comes to climate, and also, particularly when it comes to the free trade agreement, to be much less inclined to compromise and to overlook Australia's recalcitrance when it comes to those sustainability clauses in that agreement, which Europe regards as crucial, really, to its role in the world and as part of a moral imperative rather than a kind of cold economic calculation, as is often, I think, portrayed in Australia. So I think, hopefully at least that kind of explains a little bit about both the pursuit of this AUKUS alliance on the part of Australia, but also the kind of non-reaction, I suppose, to the fallout or the lack of concern really about the fallout. And that is because, historically Australian foreign and security policy has revolved around the relationship first with Britain and then with the United States. This is the kind of framing through which all decisions are really made. And I think that's why, again, we've seen such a gleeful celebration of this revived Anglosphere. And that's kind of what in my next kind of my last few minutes I wanted to focus on, because I think the term Anglosphere isn't really getting enough attention in the analysis of this agreement and what it might mean. And I just keep coming back to it because I think it really highlights the history that I've been talking about and perceptions of security in Australia, and the absolutely central and foundational role that racism plays in Australian foreign policy and Australia's role in the world. Those fears of invasion that ANZUS was built on, that the fear of abandonment from Britain came from, are rooted in a deep insecurity that drives Australian governments to participate in these American wars, to seek out American and British protection above all else. And that insecurity, as I said, is deeply racist. ANZUS is born really out of racist fears of non-white invasion. And I think too often when we talk about the history of Australia's relationship with the United States, this is glossed over. You know, it's understood as entirely logical that fears of Japanese invasion in particular would drive Australia to seek out this kind of protection. And without minimizing the impact of Japanese actions, particularly in Northern Australia, or, you know, without suggesting that the fears in Australia of Japanese invasion weren't real, because they were pervasive and very real, those fears weren't based on evidence. There isn't historical evidence that the Japanese were planning a full-scale land invasion of Australia. In fact, the Japanese military was against such a rule, you know, was against such a development. And most of what Japan was doing in Australia was about isolating the United States. And I think, you know, we do ourselves a historical disservice if we don't really understand the motivations that we're talking about, and also acknowledge that by the time ANZUS was signed in 1951, there is absolutely no prospect of a Japanese invasion of Australia. The United States was signing a peace treaty with Japan. And I think, you know, part of the reason that this is often glossed over in our more popular histories of the ANZUS Treaty in particular is because this is a kind of foundational national question for Australia. This is, you know, in the 1950s, this is a white settler colonial government living on stolen land, painfully aware that it is living on stolen land, and afraid really that that land is going to be stolen again by somebody else, and particularly by non-white countries in our region. This is a pervasive belief that drives this kind of seeking out of American security protection, and it hasn't gone away in the 70 years since. And that really, I think, is what ANZUS is about. And it's what AUKUS is about. You know, I think it's important, of course, to acknowledge that ANZUS is a product too of the Cold War and that kind of existential conflict. But in Australia, at least from the Australian perspective, our external enemies, the perceptions that we make about our external enemies is that they are always non-white. It's Japan, and then it's Korea, and then it's Vietnam. Indonesia had a go, and today, of course, it's China. And ANZUS, I think, from the very start, set Australian governments up to make a kind of choice, I suppose, between the United States and China. Now, we know, of course, you know, I think AUKUS tells us definitively that there isn't that choice. No, it wasn't that long ago that there was talk of a kind of walking a middle ground between the United States and China, but AUKUS has kind of put that to bed. And I think it's really important that we kind of acknowledge this narrative that we see about China coming out of Australia and the United States, as Gorana outlined, about AUKUS as being a kind of response to rising Chinese aggression. And that line is deployed really uncritically, I think, in so much Australian analysis. But of course, you know, to the flip side of that China is not allowed to respond to any rising aggression on the part of Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom. And I think it's worth really mentioning the difficulty of talking about this in the Australian context. You know, too often any kind of considered analysis of Australia's relationship with China will be dismissed as coming from a China apologist. And I want to emphasize that is not at all what I am attempting to do in this analysis. I think there are really important, difficult, messy questions, moral questions about China that Australia needs to address and absolutely should address. But too often those moral questions are completely mischaracterized. And I think that goes to Roman's point about the amateurism really of Australian diplomacy. You know, that doesn't just apply to Australia's relationship with France. I think it applies to Australia's relationship with China and an understanding of China more broadly. And that again is partly because Australian foreign policy is framed around this question of existential military threat, you know, rather than much as the French analysis or the French approach or the European Union approach, which is focused on regional security and regional partnerships in order to secure, in order to provide security to the region. Australia has never really viewed security in that way. So I suppose, you know, to given the time to kind of wrap that all up, I think racism and ignorance really has kind of driven this pursuit of nuclear submarines and a deepening of Australia's security relationship with the United States. And again, you know, this always assumes that what other countries do, what the Chinese government in particular do, is unrelated really to what the Australian government does or what it does with the United States. And again, that is reflective of a really long history of Australia's relationship with the United States. So I hope that has kind of illuminated the Australian perspective on this, and I hope explained a little bit the Australian reactions and non-reactions to French and European anger in response to AUKUS. And I'm really looking forward to continuing the discussion and maybe answering some questions.
Yes,
Thanks,
thank you, Emma. That's brought it right home. And people have started to put questions in the chat, but the first question actually comes from Romain.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gorana and Emma, for your talks. I think it was wonderful to have, you know, the American angle, the Australian angle, and perhaps the French angle, which goes to show that perhaps the European Union does not really exist for as long as it's not military united. That may or may never come. My question to you, and I'm going to go whole Paul Keating or Billy Hughes on you, Emma, is, are we deluded to think that America would ever help us, in the sense that Britain abandoned Australia in 1942 in Singapore? The US, and Gorana may correct me, but I do not believe as a historian that there is any historical occurrence of the US helping an ally without them being at war for their own purposes. The US did not get involved in World War I until 1917. They let Europe completely, you know, same for World War II. Until they weren't attacked at Pearl Harbor, they didn't come. And again, they did not come to save Australia. They couldn't care less. It was just a convenient military base. So are we deluded to think that the US would actually help us? American soldiers are very unlikely to fight for Australia. Don't you think?
I think it's a really good question, and one I'm asked frequently, and I'm sure Gorana gets this question as well. I would always say that, you know, the ANZUS in particular is not a security guarantee. You know, it doesn't matter which way you spin it. There's no legal obligation, in as much as international law can ever create legal obligations for the United States to come to Australia's rescue, you know, should that situation arise. That's not to say I think that the United States wouldn't, you know, intervene in some kind of conflict involving Australia, but I think you've certainly pointed at my answer, in that the United States would only ever do that if the United States saw it as within American interests to do so. There would absolutely be a huge push in the United States to intervene, partly driven by moral obligation, I think, you know, on the part of many Americans who feel loyalty to Australia for very different reasons. So the pressure would be high. And I think, you know, we know that the American political system is geared towards military intervention, you know, more than it isn't. And so there would always be that factor at play. But you can also entirely foresee a scenario where, you know, the United States, an administration, a democratic administration elected, you know, on the basis of ending forever wars, is extremely reluctant to put troops on the ground anywhere, you know, let alone in Australia. And I think that's really important for Australia to consider. And I think, though, the question is also a really important one when we think about its framing, because so often that question is framed kind of passively, you know, would the United States come to Australia's rescue, you know, presumably, like, this is very rarely said out loud, but, you know, if China decided, if the Chinese government decided to invade Australia. And we usually get sort of asked that question instead of asking, well, actually, what role could Australia play to prevent that from happening in the first place? And I think that's where the narrative really needs to shift. I think, like, if Australia ever wanted to play a different role in the world. So I hope that answers your question.
And Gorana, would you like to add to that, please?
Yeah, I will be just brief, and I would maybe, again, I don't want to step away from the question, but just to kind of situate it also in the historical context, or the immediate historical context, and that is that a lot of these questions have actually been put front and center because of the previous US administration, right? I mean, there are always these worries. So any sort of, this is alliances 101, right? Whenever we speak to undergrads, right, we refer always to alliances through different sort of prisms, right? States are called monsters. You can't, like they only do alliances because it suits their interest. There is no such thing as a special relationship. All this talk about, mateship, 100 years of mateship, the idealist sort of views, it's our culture, values, and so on. And I think that speaks also to Emma's point around the importance also of some of these cultural underpinnings that have actually made us less critical of the alliance itself, right? But basically, and then the next sort of thing that I normally talk about is the fact that any alliance relationship always has this, the points of the fears of abandonment, but also the fears of entrapment. And both the senior and the junior partner can feel the same way, right? About being entrapped if the junior partner decides to pursue some sort of morally hazardous policy, or the junior partner if the senior partner decides to just bring them along for the ride that they obviously don't want to pursue. And then there is also this fear of abandonment, and obviously that one is much more shared by those that are juniors in any relationship. But I think that really, in terms of the US-Australia alliance, Trump was that jolt. And I think that for a lot of other allies around the world, Trump was, the president that kind of broke and tore all of those playbooks. And at least, even when there were fears before, there would soon be, kind of lessened by, the standard kind of diplomatic shuttling and, will recommit and says, but Trump was just so irreverent about all of these things that really now, whatever Biden does, is not going to be enough. And if anything, things that he has done have really rubbed the very wrong way of those traditional allies, where now it is really fair to call on the United States because it is also a question of, the capabilities and what it is that the US can realistically do in this part of the world, given that it is not a continental power of the like that obviously China is. It has certainly a greater diplomatic effort, diplomatic network, right? It enjoys some of the advantages in terms of being able to at least theoretically mobilize those that are partners and allies. But at the same time, that sort of question of, both Roman, you and Emma raised, whether we are seeing this kind of spiral of escalation and what it's going to imply. And, everyone looking into Taiwan these days as to, what really it would commit to Australia, what it would make Australia commit to doing. So, I would just leave it at that.
Thanks, Gorana. Now, Remy Davison, you have raised a couple of points.
Did you want me to do it orally, Matt?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks very much to the speakers. Just to come back to points that have been made, I think by Romain and by Emma as well, is that having supervised and currently supervising senior people in the Navy doesn't think like that. Navy thinks about what it can get off the shelf. So when, and it's often the case too, that obviously Navy doesn't, and the military doesn't announce these things for several years after the decisions are being taken. So if you go back to something like Aegis air sea warfare systems, this was decided in 2000, but the Howard government didn't announce it until about 5 years later. But I can tell you the decision was taken 5 years later. Similarly, I think Morrison has said, correct me if I'm wrong, that the decision was taken in 2018. He started thinking about this, I think he said. Was that right? So in other words, that Morrison took this decision when Trump was still in office, and probably with the expectation that Trump would remain in office beyond 2021. I'm not having an argument about whether we should be aligned with Trump or not, or why Morrison has done this. But just to come back to Romain, one of the things maybe you'd like to comment on is the trilateral between France and India and Australia, because of course that had its first dialogue meeting in 2020. And I'm not sure what's going to happen to that in the future, but that's an important one, I think, because it's about trilateral management and a dialogue forum in the Asia Pacific. And it's quite interesting too, because France deliberately excluded the United States from that forum. It didn't want the United States to be in that forum. Whereas, as you know, I mean, India's in another mini-lateral with Japan and Australia, plus the Quad with Australia. Do you want to comment on that, Romain?
Okay, thank you. Look, I'll try to keep it very brief. On the military aspect, you're right. There is a sense in Australia that you need to get things off the shelf because it's more convenient, it goes quicker. But as you know, it comes with string attached. And often it comes and it's not operational. We can talk about helicopters, we can talk about the F-35. I might be more nationalist than the nationalists themselves, but I think it's high time that Australia bite the bullet and does things on its own. That's the only way to guarantee some form of sovereignty. Of course, it will cost us 3 times more, if not more, but it might be the cost of sovereignty not to be drawn in other people's war, and also not to have that very scary trans-operation ability between American troop and Australian troops. As the IAF was part of the British Army, we're increasingly becoming part, like just another few divisions of the American Army. So on the military aspect, I understand the off-the-shelf thing, but it's very dangerous for Australia's sovereignty and future. Also, there is a change of strategy. I remember talking about the submarine deals when it was being made with an admiral here in Australia. And I told him at the time very naively, but France has nuclear-propelled, nuclear-armed subs. I understand you don't want the nuke weapons, but come on, get the nuclear-propelled stuff, which wasn't a given that France would share that technology. But he said, why would we? And I said, well, because you'd be much quieter under the water, could go further. And he said, but perhaps we don't want. Perhaps we want to be heard patrolling our coast. Perhaps we are just happy to go around Australia. So we've shifted completely the military doctrine to minding our own business and protecting our borders to potentially going out there, right? So that is something that hasn't been discussed, but has real impact, just like what Emma was saying about the nuclear. With regard to your other question on the diplomatic aspect of things, France had a closer relation to India than Australia for several decades now, and that has been built on the back of military contract as well. I'm sure you know about this, whether it's aircraft like the Rafale, whether it's submarines as well. And the point about excluding the US is that, you know, the US is not convinced of multipolarism. The US thrive in bipolarism, whether it was with the Cold War or whether it's, you know, with China today. They do the talk about being multipolar, but really they are not. So if you start siding with one of the big powers, you lose any attention that people could pay to you. And this is a very Gaullist tradition. We know who are our friends. Our friends are the United States, but we do not want to side with the US during the Cold War, nor with the Soviets. And this is why France developed its own nuclear systems. So France had this idea, which the left and the right and the center share, that it's best to have a lower key diplomacy because you're not the second empire of the world anymore, but one that is middle range and not taking side that could be irreparable. Hence the development of relationship with India as well, which is seeking to develop its own program outside of that bipolar China-US. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Now we have a question from Christopher Pennycook about who is the real winner from AUKUS, and Gorana, you had some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. I think Biden managed to increase the security burden on an ally beyond what Trump would even, dream of. So he recognized how willing Australia would be. So I think US probably wins the day with AUKUS, but UK also gets a nod because it, at least, with that kind of partnership, the whole idea of the Indo-Pacific tilt that they put forward in their defense review earlier in the year is at least to an extent, that kind of dream of global Britain Emma alluded to is seen through. So I would say in that order.
Thank you. Now, I think this will be the last question, but from Jerry Corvasanos to Emma, what is Australia's strategic position relative to Pacific neighbours, if we're seeing ourselves as abandoned?
That's a good question. Thanks, Jerry. Hi, Jerry. Look, I think what we've seen in terms of the fallout really from AUKUS is the Australian government's really complete dismissal of our Pacific neighbours and complete disinterest really in their security or in their future. You can see that in a number of ways, I think, through the dismissal of reactions coming out of the Pacific of real concern about the presence of nuclear-powered submarines or the increased presence of nuclear-powered submarines in the Pacific. But, more broadly, I think what I'd go to is that question of how, the ANZUS Treaty creates this kind of blinding effect where we only look at the United States and we also only see threat, we perceive threat as existential threat as coming from other people, which means that, Australian governments, particularly recently, have been fundamentally unable to see climate change as the existential threat it is and something that needs to be approached with a similar level of commitment. And so I think, you can see that playing out with AUKUS, both from Australia and the United States, which is giving primacy to security, to military security over climate security. And so, and I think the Pacific sees that, Pacific neighbours see that for what it is and have for a long time. And that really is an enormous roadblock to Australia ever really engaging as a good faith actor in the Pacific, which at the moment I think we're just fundamentally unable to do.
Well, thank you. I think that's quite a good note to end on, given that we've had assurances of France's continuing engagement, particularly with being part of the Pacific and our neighbours. Also reminded that given that we're now a trans-Tasman organisation, ESAANZ, there's been virtually no mention of New Zealand tonight, but this is partly because it doesn't seem that AUKUS paid any heed to New Zealand either. So that will be much food for thought going forward. But I'd like to thank all our speakers for their excellent contributions and the audience for your attendance, and look out for the next ESAANZ event. And thank you all very much. And I wish you a good night. Serena, you wanted to say a word? Okay. So thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye all.